From the outside, the world of Joni Lamb looks polished, controlled, and perfectly lit, the way only a television set can make life appear. For decades she sat at the heart of a network that shaped Christian broadcasting, her voice steady, her composure almost unshakable, and her presence woven into the routine of millions of viewers who trusted her as the elegant face of Daystar. But behind that carefully curated image were a series of quiet scandals, some whispered, some public, that reshaped not only the network but her personal identity. These moments didn't explode in the dramatic way tabloids love. They unfolded slowly, almost quietly, building over years and revealing a different kind of story. One where influence, faith, loyalty, and scrutiny collided in ways no one truly expected. And it is in these quieter, less sensational cracks that the real history of Joni Lamb began to show itself. Long before the cameras framed her as a confident host, Joni had already learned what silence can conceal and what public life demands. Her marriage to Marcus Lamb was the foundation of the empire, a partnership that seemed unbreakable on screen. Together they built Daystar from almost nothing, turning it into a television giant known across nations. They were, for many viewers, a united front, two visionaries in perfect agreement. But anyone who paid close attention to the small shifts over the years could sense that the burdens behind the scenes were not equal, and that unspoken pressures were constantly rearranging the dynamics of their marriage, their ministry, and the network. Those pressures began to surface publicly around 2010, when the sexual misconduct accusation against Marcus Lamb emerged. It was a scandal that could have collapsed the network completely, the kind of news that Christian audiences react to with a mixture of shock, betrayal, and speculation. Joni was suddenly thrust into a role she never asked for. The defender, the explainer, the woman who had to stand beside her husband and hold the narrative together. She took to the screen in a live program, visibly composed but undeniably strained, revealing the affair herself before the story could be leaked elsewhere. Her tone was calm, rehearsed, and purposeful, but viewers who rewatch the moment can notice the controlled tightness in her voice. For many, this moment became a defining chapter of her public life. She framed the situation as an attack, describing alleged extortion attempts and presenting herself and Marcus as spiritual targets. Whether intentionally or instinctively, she turned a personal wound into a public defense of the ministry, positioning the network, and by extension her marriage, as victims fighting a spiritual battle. It was a strategic move, one that solidified her image as the unwavering anchor of the empire. But for others it raised quiet questions. What did she really feel behind the scenes? How much had she endured long before the audience ever heard a word? And how did the scandal reshape her power within Daystar? In the years that followed, viewers began to notice that Joni's presence on screen grew more central and more commanding. She wasn't just the wife of the founder. She was becoming a leader in her own right. She began hosting more programs, taking stronger stances on issues, and appearing more frequently in interviews where her perspective took the spotlight. Some saw this as natural growth. After all, she had always been a co-founder. Others saw it as evidence of a shift within the Lamb household and the ministry, a quiet transfer of influence that began when the marital scandal placed her in a position of public authority and moral clarity. As Marcus's health declined years later, especially after his contracted COVID-19 illness in 2021, viewers again saw Joni step forward even more boldly. Her public updates about his condition were emotional, carefully worded, and shared widely across Christian media. When he eventually passed away, she became the face of the grieving ministry, the steady presence assuring viewers that Daystar would continue, that she would carry the mission forward, and that the network's future remained secure in her hands. But behind that strength was a storm she rarely addressed: the enormous responsibility of maintaining an empire, while managing a series of financial and legal controversies that had surrounded Daystar through the years. One of the most publicly discussed controversies involved the network's use and later repayment of a multi-million-dollar Paycheck Protection Program loan. Critics questioned why a major religious broadcasting empire needed such funds. Supporters argued that the loan was legally obtained and later returned. But regardless of which side people believed, Joni became the one viewers looked to for explanations. She had to speak, even when the explanations were met with skepticism. She had to remain poised, even when journalists published reports that scrutinized Daystar's finances and spending patterns. These controversies forced her into a delicate position, maintaining transparency without revealing internal vulnerabilities, defending decisions without exposing strategy, and appearing humble without ceding authority. Each time she addressed the public, her voice carried that same polished steadiness, but it also carried something else, something more human, a trace of exhaustion. Years of defending the ministry, navigating scandals, maintaining relationships with donors, and being the emotional anchor for her audience had carved a new version of herself, one that was both harder and more careful. She learned over time how to speak without revealing too much, how to comfort without promising more than the ministry could deliver, and how to remain relatable while sitting atop a global broadcasting empire. But perhaps the most fascinating part of Joni's quiet scandals lies not in the major headlines, but in the subtle shifts within the network. Viewers began to notice staffing changes, host replacements, sudden disappearances of familiar faces, and leadership transitions that were never fully explained. As the co-founder and eventually the most visible figurehead of Daystar, Joni became the unofficial spokesperson for these changes, even when she never addressed them publicly. Her silence often became interpreted as strategy, and her rare public comments carried heavier weight because of it. What many didn't know was how deeply the internal atmosphere of the network was affected by these transitions. Rumors circulated over the years about intense expectations, strong personalities, and disagreements about the direction of the ministry, especially after Marcus's death. While none of these internal tensions reached the level of public scandal, they shaped the narrative behind the scenes, and people who worked closely with the Lamb family understood that Joni was no longer just carrying the legacy, she was actively steering it. And leadership always comes with friction, especially in a space where faith, business, family loyalty, and public scrutiny intersect. Her on-screen persona during this era became even more interesting. Viewers noticed her confidence shift into something sharper, almost as if she had stepped fully into a role she had been preparing for without knowing it. Joni became more outspoken, more willing to address cultural issues, and more decisive in the way she framed spiritual battles, political opinions, and family matters. She had always held strong beliefs, but now the way she expressed them carried a certain authority that suggested she understood her position was larger than before, and she intended to use it. At the same time, her personal life remained a subject of speculation, especially when she remarried in 2023. The announcement came with mixed reactions from viewers, some supportive, some confused, some critical. For a public figure who had long been associated with conservative Christian values, remarriage after the death of a spouse often stirs conversation, even if quietly. And in Joni's case, it added another layer to her evolving public identity. Her new relationship became part of her narrative, intertwining with her sense of healing, leadership, and transformation. But to some, it also raised uncomfortable questions that they never voiced directly, choosing instead to observe silently as she navigated a new chapter. All of these threads, the scandal with Marcus, the financial scrutiny, the leadership transitions, the remarriage, the rising influence, combined to create the quieter scandals that truly redefined Joni Lamb's empire. They were not the scandals of tabloids or legal charges or explosive revelations. They were the scandals of perception, influence, and evolving identity. They were the moments when viewers realized that Joni was not just the calm host of a Christian talk show, but a woman who had weathered storms, made difficult decisions, shaped narratives, and adjusted to the growing weight of her responsibilities in ways few could imagine. Her strength in many ways became her trademark. But that strength was carved from years of learning how to survive public pressure without letting it destroy the ministry she helped create. It came from navigating grief while maintaining a smile for the cameras, from managing controversies while projecting unwavering faith, and from carrying a network that millions depended on for spiritual comfort. And while many people saw only the polished results, the story behind that strength remained layered with complexities, tensions, and quiet scandals that transformed her into the figure she is today. The real depth of Joni's story becomes clearer when you revisit the 2010 crisis with fresh eyes, not as a moment frozen in time, but as a turning point that rippled into everything that came after. When the affair was revealed on national television, viewers saw a poised woman who sat beside her husband with a controlled calmness, announcing to the world what many spouses would never want whispered in private. But behind that calm facade was a woman who must have understood instantly that the revelation would change her life, her marriage, and her ministry forever. The decision to go public was framed as necessary, a way to prevent a potential leak, but it was also a strategic act of survival. She knew that silence would allow rumors to control the narrative. Speaking first meant she controlled it. During the broadcast, the couple presented the situation through a spiritual lens, explaining that they were being extorted for money and that the affair had occurred years earlier. Joni held her posture with remarkable discipline, offering support, forgiveness, and faith as if she had rehearsed those emotions into her bones. But anyone who examined her eyes in that moment could sense the strain. There was pain, but there was also resolve. The resolve of someone who understood that her husband's mistake could become her burden, that his scandal could become her story, and that the ministry would lean on her more than ever. It was in this moment that the public first saw the strength that Joni would later be known for. Her commitment to keeping the ministry intact created a subtle shift in how viewers perceived her. She wasn't just a wife covering a wound. She was a leader stepping into a crisis with the full weight of the network behind her. She emphasized forgiveness, redemption, and spiritual warfare, themes that appealed deeply to viewers who believed in second chances. For many supporters, her forgiveness became a powerful testimony. For critics, it raised questions. Did she have a choice? Was she protecting her family or protecting the empire? And what did it cost her privately? These questions would follow her quietly for years, not loudly discussed but lingering in the background of every major decision she made afterward. The scandal forced her into a more public leadership role, and as she continued appearing on television, she seemed to settle into that position almost naturally. But natural or not, the responsibility reshaped her. It hardened her in ways the audience could sense but not fully explain. Her voice became firmer, her presence sharper, her words more carefully measured. She learned to speak like someone who had carried a burden and survived it. The affair scandal was not the only challenge that shaped the Daystar empire during those years. Financial scrutiny became another recurring theme, especially when Daystar's operations were examined by reporters and watchdog groups. The ministry's expansive properties, high production costs, and the lifestyles of its leaders often attracted attention. Whenever questions about transparency emerged, it was usually Joni who faced them publicly. Her responses were always confident and structured, emphasizing lawful operation, donor trust, and mission-driven spending. But behind those public assurances was a complicated reality. Running a global television ministry required enormous funds, and maintaining donor confidence meant navigating criticism with absolute composure. The Paycheck Protection Program controversy in 2020 was one of those moments. When Daystar accepted a multi-million-dollar federal loan designed to help businesses affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, critics questioned whether a large ministry with vast assets should qualify. When Daystar later repaid the loan, supporters saw it as evidence of integrity, while others saw it as a strategic retreat under pressure. Joni carried the responsibility of addressing these concerns indirectly, even if she did not always speak about them publicly. Her silence at times spoke louder than statements ever could. By the time Marcus Lamb passed away in 2021, Joni had already become the unofficial driving force behind the network. His death placed her at the center of the ministry in a way that no crisis before had done. The emotional weight of losing a spouse she had stood beside for decades was immense. She delivered tributes, interviews, and heartfelt messages expressing faith and strength. Her grief resonated with many viewers who saw her as an example of unwavering trust in God's plan. But while the world saw her grieving, she was also stepping into the reality that the ministry was now fully on her shoulders. Leadership transitions, especially in family-based ministries, are rarely simple. The Lamb children, who had grown up on screen and worked within the ministry, also stepped forward, but it was clear that Joni's role was the stabilizing force. She had to guide the network through both emotional recovery and structural recalibration. The weight of decisions that Marcus once carried fell to her. Even small choices became symbolic: which programs to maintain, which to modify, who would lead what department, and how to maintain donor confidence after the loss of the founder. Every decision reflected her evolving leadership, and every quiet change inside the ministry hinted at subtle shifts in influence and direction. During this time, viewers began noticing changes that sparked quiet speculation. Some hosts no longer appeared regularly. Certain programs shifted tone. Staff members who had been part of Daystar's familiar fabric were suddenly absent. No official statements were given, but the pattern was unmistakable. These transitions were not scandals in the conventional sense, but they carried the energy of internal restructuring, delicate, unspoken, and undeniably transformative. In every one of these shifts, whether publicly mentioned or not, Joni's fingerprints were evident. She was shaping Daystar into a version that reflected her judgment, her convictions, and her sense of direction. Her remarriage in 2023 brought a new wave of attention. Although remarriage after widowhood is allowed and not unusual within Christian communities, the public nature of her platform meant that every personal decision became a matter of discussion. Some viewers celebrated her finding companionship again. Others reacted with discomfort, questioning the timing or expressing concerns based on their own theological expectations. These reactions rarely surfaced openly. Instead, they brewed quietly in comment sections, private conversations, and prayer groups. And just like previous moments in her life, her silence on the criticism became part of the story. She let the decision speak for itself, and in doing so, she showed once again that she was willing to weather public perception without bending to it. The new marriage symbolized something deeper. Her transition from the shadow of Marcus's legacy into a life that was fully her own. For decades, her identity had been tied to him as a co-founder, co-host, and ministry partner. His presence shaped the network, shaped her public role, and shaped the way viewers saw her. With remarriage, she took a step into independence, into a future that was not defined by the past. It was a personal choice, but because her life was intertwined with the ministry empire, it became a public shift with spiritual, emotional, and organizational implications. All of these moments, the scandal, the financial scrutiny, the leadership responsibilities, the remarriage, combined over time to create what many now call the quiet scandals of Joni Lamb's empire. They were not explosive events but rather gradual evolutions, subtle conflicts, and decisions that shaped the future of Daystar in ways viewers are still trying to understand. Her reputation evolved through each of these chapters. She became both a survivor and a strategist, someone who understood the heavy cost of influence and carried it with a calmness forged through trial. What makes these scandals quiet is not the lack of significance but the way they unfolded. They were handled behind closed doors, softened on camera, framed through faith, or left unspoken entirely. They did not destroy the ministry but reshaped it. They did not ruin her reputation but redefined it. And perhaps that is what makes her story so compelling. The realization that the power she now holds was not inherited easily, but carved through pain, loyalty, and an unwavering belief in her mission. Her journey reveals how public figures in religious broadcasting navigate a world where faith intersects with finances, where spiritual authority meets organizational pressure, and where the expectations of millions create a weight that never really disappears. It shows how a woman who started as a supportive partner became the face of resilience, learning to balance transparency with discretion and leadership with grace. And it shows how the quietest scandals, the ones not screamed in headlines, can sometimes be the ones that change the course of an entire empire. The more the years passed, the more it became clear that Joni had become the gravitational center of Daystar, not only because she was the surviving co-founder, but because she had learned how to absorb storms without letting the audience feel the tremors. The people watching at home rarely sensed the internal pressure that came with managing an empire built on faith, yet constantly scrutinized through the lens of public expectations. But those who understood her world well enough could see how every quiet shift, every staff change, every financial decision, every on-air moment, carried traces of her steady hand guiding an institution that was too large, too influential, and too emotionally demanding to run without resilience that bordered on steel. The audience saw her as graceful, warm, and motherly, but behind the scenes she had to be strategic, measured, and unyielding. Running a global network required more than spiritual devotion. It required business intelligence, emotional discipline, and the ability to outlast controversy without allowing it to compromise the mission or collapse donor confidence. These were skills she did not acquire overnight. They were forged from years of quietly handling challenges that never made it to television screens. One of the most defining of these quiet battles involved the constant pressure to maintain relevance in an evolving media landscape. Christian broadcasting was no longer the only place believers went for spiritual nourishment. The internet had opened a universe of voices. Independent preachers, YouTube prophets, online ministers, Instagram devotionals, and podcasts with millions of listeners. The competition for attention was no longer between networks. It was between every individual with a smartphone and a message. Joni could not ignore this shift, and she did not. Daystar expanded its online presence, building stronger digital platforms, streaming services, and social media strategies. But even as these efforts grew, critics questioned whether the ministry was adapting fast enough. Younger audiences moved toward modern formats, shorter clips, faster content, and less formal spiritual conversations. The calm, structured style of traditional Christian television seemed old-fashioned to them. Yet Joni still had to hold on to the older audience that had supported Daystar since its earliest days. Balancing these two worlds required a subtle type of leadership, one that didn't panic, didn't chase trends, and didn't allow the network to lose its identity in pursuit of relevance. In many ways, this tension mirrored her personal life, evolving while staying anchored to tradition, moving forward while holding on to the past, reshaping the future without damaging the foundation. Her ability to walk this line became one of her most underappreciated strengths. She navigated change gracefully, adjusting the network's direction without letting it feel like a departure from the Lamb legacy. She appeared on new platforms, engaged with younger Christian influencers, and brought fresh voices to the network. Yet she still preserved the classic tone that longtime viewers trusted. This was not an accident. It was a calculated approach designed to protect the ministry's identity, while ensuring its survival in a world that moved faster every year. But as Daystar grew more digital, it also grew more visible, and visibility always brings scrutiny. Reports examining the network's finances, property holdings, and spending patterns surfaced periodically. Some critics were fair, others sensational. Each report required careful internal strategy. If Joni responded too quickly, it could appear defensive. If she stayed silent, it could appear evasive. The truth was more complicated. Each situation had to be evaluated through the lens of legal advice, donor relationships, and long-term reputation. Silence was not always a refusal to speak. Sometimes it was wisdom shaped by experience. Her strength in navigating these moments came from understanding something most viewers never consider. Ministries are built on trust, and trust is fragile. Once broken, it can take years or decades to rebuild. She had already lived through one of the most intimate breaches of trust a public figure can endure, and she had survived it not through avoidance but through transparency that was painful yet necessary. That experience had taught her exactly how missteps in communication could damage the network, so she approached every public challenge with a caution sharpened by history. Internally, however, the pressure was immense. Running a ministry that spanned multiple countries, handled major events, and broadcasted globally required leadership that few could comprehend. Staff came to her with problems ranging from production issues to financial logistics to interpersonal conflicts. Donors needed reassurance. Viewers needed comfort. The board needed direction. Her children needed partnership. And through all of this, she had to maintain the polished image expected of a Christian leader. Calm, confident, smiling, gracious, prayerful. The emotional labor behind that image was rarely seen but always present. What made these years even more complex was the rising polarization of religious audiences. Cultural battles, political divisions, and theological disagreements were no longer subtle. They were shaping the direction of entire ministries. Viewers expected leaders to take stands on elections, on pandemics, on doctrine, on societal issues. Silence could be interpreted as weakness. A single statement could alienate thousands. Joni understood that every word spoken on air had a ripple effect, and the network's position on any major issue would be attributed largely to her. Whether she wanted that responsibility or not, she carried it. Her public voice became more assertive during this time, not necessarily because she changed her beliefs, but because the world around her had changed. She spoke boldly about faith, morality, and cultural challenges, framing them not through political angles but through spiritual conviction. Supporters admired her clarity and courage. Critics labeled her polarizing. But she did not waver. She had spent decades learning that leadership in ministry is not about pleasing everyone. It is about standing firm in what you believe, even when the world demands compromise. Yet no matter how strong her public voice became, the quiet scandals continued shaping the undercurrent of her story. These were not scandals of wrongdoing but scandals of perception, of leadership decisions, of public reactions. Each quiet controversy added another layer to how the world saw her. Some viewers saw a woman rising into power gracefully. Others saw a leader becoming more authoritative. Some saw transparency. Others saw calculation. Some saw faith. Others saw strategy. And the truth, as always, lived somewhere between perception and reality. The remarriage drew its own mixture of whispers and interpretations. Her new husband entered a world already shaped by legacy, grief, and decades of public scrutiny. It was not an easy place for anyone to step into. For Joni, the decision was about companionship, healing, and moving forward. But she also knew that her personal life had always been tied to the ministry's public image. She navigated this new chapter carefully, sharing enough to be honest but not enough to invite unnecessary speculation. Her fans saw a woman embracing life again. Her critics tried to connect dots that did not exist. She simply lived, understanding that no matter what she did, it would be dissected with equal devotion and suspicion. As she moved deeper into this new season, leadership at Daystar became more centralized around her than ever before. She made more executive decisions. She oversaw more strategic planning. She became the anchor not just of the television programs but of the organizational identity itself. Some described her approach as bold. Others described it as decisive. But everyone agreed on one thing. She had become the most powerful woman in Christian broadcasting, not through loud dominance but through decades of surviving storms that would have destroyed many leaders. Her journey through quiet scandals had shaped her into something rare. A public figure who understood the cost of influence, the value of silence, the weight of transparency, and the danger of underestimating the audience. She learned to read between lines, to sense the atmosphere around her, to anticipate reactions before they came, and to act decisively without appearing reactionary. She mastered the art of leading without exposing vulnerability, guiding without announcing, and evolving without abandoning her roots. And perhaps this is the deepest layer of her story, the realization that the scandals which shaped her were not the loud ones but the subtle ones, the ones that asked her to choose between protecting her family or protecting her ministry, between holding her pain privately or turning it into public testimony, between staying silent or speaking up, between clinging to the past or stepping into the future with courage. These were the decisions that defined her empire. These were the moments that redefined who she had become.